Okay guys, so let's get started on chapter 17, lesson 1 and 2. In the past chapter, we were talking about the Civil War that split the country into two pieces, the Union that wanted to free the slaves and the Confederacy that wanted to keep them. Now that that war is over, we have to figure out a way to put the two pieces of the country back together. So Abraham Lincoln began his second term as president as the war was ending. He was re-elected, he beat George McClellan, and his job now is to put the country back together. In his inaugural address, he says he wants to rebuild the Union. And by the Union, he means the entire United States. He wants the Americans to forget the war and move on, move past it. He puts together a plan to rebuild the country. Because if you remember, in the last lesson, we talked about Ulysses Grant and George Sherman, who burned a path of destruction through the South, trying to make them finally submit and, admit defeat in the war. The president's plan said a state could rejoin the Union when 10% of its voters promised to take an oath pledging their loyalty to the United States. So on that map we did a while ago with the red states and the blue states, he's saying those red states can rejoin the country once 10% of the people promise that they accept that the United States is a country and the Confederacy is no longer anything. He also offers amnesty or a pardon. An amnesty and pardons are when you are forgiven for your crimes. Even though you may be guilty, you won't face punishment. So he's telling the South that you guys can rejoin the country and we'll forget those crimes you committed. He said new state governments had to be formed and they had to obey the ban on slavery. Now, Lincoln knows a lot of people in Congress don't agree with his plan. Some people want to punish the South for starting this war, but Lincoln sees that it's more important to put the country back together. So Lincoln decides to take a little bit of time off, and he goes to a place called Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to watch a play. And the president back then did not have the type of security you see today. So while he's watching the play, a guy named John Wilkes Booth, he's a supporter of the South, walks up behind Abe Lincoln, shoots him in the head, and jumps off the balcony onto the stage. He runs out. I believe he has a broken leg or a broken ankle, and they take the president to the closest medical facility they can to try to save his life. But he was just shot in the head at point blank range. A few days after the assassination, they track down John Wilkes Booth, and some soldiers kill him as well. So Abe Lincoln does not live to see the country put back together. He got us through the war, but he was not able to put the two pieces of the country back into one. In the South, the damage from the war had been catastrophic. These farms and plantations were destroyed, the bridges were destroyed. The Confederacy was printing its own money, but since they lost the war, that money was worthless. That would be like if you spent a bunch of money on gift certificates for a brand new restaurant in town, and then that restaurant goes out of business. Your gift certificates are worthless then. The same concept happened with the Confederate money. Since there was no money and everything was destroyed, a lot of people who used to be wealthy and rich were poor now. So they could not afford to rebuild the South. A lot of these banks ended up closing because they were full of Confederate money, and that money was worthless now. The roads in the South had been destroyed, the bridges were destroyed, the farms were destroyed, and the South is basically laying in ruins. With the bridges being destroyed and the roads and the railroads being destroyed, it's going to be really hard to get building supplies back down there. So even if the South had the money to rebuild, rebuilding would be very difficult. The South also has very few police, no judges, no courts. Some people are trying to take the law into their own hands to keep the order there. But the South is going to be in for a rough road ahead. Another problem in the South, all these people that were slaves are now free, which is a good thing, but they have nowhere to go. These plantation owners are no longer going to let them stay on their property, and these people now they're free, but they are in effect homeless with no work and no money. So they have to find a way to get somewhere where they will be treated better and be able to make a living. So Lincoln's plan was called Reconstruction. He wanted to rebuild the South, but Lincoln was assassinated. So Andrew Johnson, his vice president, now was responsible for putting the country back together. Although he had served as vice president to Lincoln, he was not well liked by the members of Congress. Johnson was a Democrat, so he wasn't on the same team as Abe Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican. Johnson is a Democrat. He was the governor of Tennessee and a representative in Congress, and he was a senator when the war broke out. He remained loyal to the Union, even though he had lots of family and lots of ties to the South. So he tries to follow Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. He pardons most of the people who promise they're going to respect the Union and obey a ban on slavery. He appointed temporary governors in many of these states, and he set up some systems to help elect new representatives to Congress. Within a few months, most of these Confederate states had done enough to be considered part of the United States again. They had ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, which made it completely illegal. By 1865, Andrew Johnson said all of the red states, except for Texas, are back to being part of the United States again. So the president has a lot of power, but he's got to work with Congress. They're the people who make the laws. Congress met in 1865, and a group of people called the Radical Republicans, they wanted to punish the Confederacy. They were not all about forgiving this easily and letting the South off the hook. They wanted to punish the people who had started the Civil War. They thought they should be the ones who were going to pay for all of these damages, for all the repairs. So some of these southern states, once they became states again, went back to their own ways, and they started passing laws called black codes. And black codes were laws that only applied to African Americans. So the South said if they can't have slaves anymore, they were still going to find a way to discriminate. So they passed these laws called black codes, and under black codes, black men were not allowed to vote, they weren't allowed to own property, and they weren't allowed to have any job that paid decent money. So you can see that the South really did not intend on changing. They wanted to find a way to keep people working for them for very little or for nothing, and they were not ready to accept the African American people as being equals. Okay, so when Johnson let all the states rejoin, he gave voting rights back to all the Southerners. So all the Confederates, they got to vote in the next election. But he did not make it so black men could vote. So all these people who fought in a war that split the country, into two pieces, the ones who were fighting to keep slavery, they got their right to vote back. But in many places, black men were not allowed to vote. Southern whites who blamed the Republicans for the war, most of them were Democrats. The freedmen, which is a word for former slaves, they were Republicans, because Abe Lincoln was a Republican, and he's the one who signed the Emancipation Proclamation and gave them their freedom. So Congress says, we're going to put together a better plan to rebuild the South. And there's a fight going on between Congress and the president. Every time Congress passes a law, the president would veto it. And the president, when he vetoes, he's basically saying no to a law. And what happens after a veto? Congress has to vote again, and the next time they need 2/3 majority to get that law past the president's veto. So basically, Congress is saying something, president's saying no, Congress is voting again, going over his head. So they're going back and forth with this process. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act 1866 made it so African Americans were allowed to own property, they were allowed to sue people, and they were allowed to legally get married. So shortly after this, Congress proposes the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment, what it basically says is that there are certain rights that all Americans have, and those rights apply to black or African Americans. So basically, Congress passed this amendment to tell people you have to treat people equally. The only people who this did not apply to was Native Americans. So when Congress passed this amendment to the Constitution, Tennessee was the only southern state that accepted it. The other Confederate states basically said they're not going to treat people equally. They don't have to. Congress creates something next called the Freedmen's Bureau. If you remember back just a few pages ago, we were talking about how many of these former slaves are now free, but they have no options. They have nothing they can do for themselves. So Congress started something called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was set up for a couple different things. It was set up to help African Americans who were injured in the war. And it was also set up to help these former slaves, these freedmen, find homes, find jobs, and for their children to go to school. They were trying to protect the civil rights of these people. And civil rights are the basic human rights belonging to all people. So the 14th Amendment was really trying to give civil rights to everybody. Okay, so do you guys remember a couple of chapters ago we talked about Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears? Well, Andrew Johnson is going to do something very similar. In the 1830s, the United States took the land away from the Native Americans and basically just said this is ours now and forced them to move. When the Civil War began, many of these Native American tribes sided with the Confederacy, sided with the South. And when the South was defeated, these Native American groups were forced to sign new treaties. They were also forced to give up their land and allow us to build railroads going through their properties. Many of these Native American tribes were forced to leave their homes again, and this is basically like the Trail of Tears Part 2. They call it the Second Great Removal, where many of these groups lose their homes once again. Okay, almost done. So, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. In 1867, Congress passes the first 4 Reconstruction Acts, and the president says no. So we're going back to that veto. They pass a law, the president says no, they go past his veto by getting even more votes. The first act said that the 10 states that had not returned to the Union would be put under military rule if they did not start following the regulations. So they're basically telling the South, if you can't get right, we're going to send the army there to make sure you do get right. They said if that doesn't work, we'll divide the South into 5 brand new sections. And one of the more important parts is they said that in order for these states to become part of the United States officially, they had to hold brand new elections and they had to elect white and black men. Congress also had to approve the state's constitution and they had to accept the 14th Amendment before they could rejoin the Union. So, one side of the plan wants to make it easy for these states to rejoin the Union again, and another side of the plan kind of wants to make them pay for some of the damage they caused. So there's all this fighting going back and forth between Congress and the president. Congress, is getting really frustrated with him because every time they try to do something, he is vetoing them. So he's basically just slowing down everything they're trying to do. In 1867, Congress passes something called the Tenure of Office Act. And what this does is it makes it so the president is no longer allowed to fire people. So they basically told the president, you need our permission before you fire anybody. And think about this when someone tells you not to do something. One of the things you want to do is do that thing they specifically told you not to do. So they tell the president, you're not allowed to fire anybody anymore. The president says, watch me. And he fires someone. He fires a guy named Edward Stanton. So what happens? People get furious. They say, we told you couldn't fire anybody. You broke the law. So since the president technically did break the law, they want to impeach him. So they say, we're going to have a trial, we're going to do the impeachment process, and we're going to remove Andrew Johnson from the presidency. So to remove somebody, it's a couple-step process. The House of Representatives, the part of Congress with more members, they vote, and they vote with enough people to kick the president out. So they're halfway there. The Senate then has to decide. If the Senate can agree to remove the president, he will be removed from office and lose his job. So the Senate has a trial. In order to reach the 2/3 decision, they need 36 senators to agree to remove him from office. So what happens? They are one vote short of removing him from office. 35 of the senators vote to remove him. If one more would have done it, he would have been removed, and he'd be the first president to actually be removed from office and lose their position. So they were one vote short of firing him. Okay, so Andrew Johnson is in a tough place. Imagine you're working at a restaurant. Say you're working at McDonald's, and you got some other coworker who's always snitching on you, trying to get you fired. Are you going to want to work a shift with that person? Probably not. So Andrew Johnson has to work with this Congress that tried to fire him. And as a result of that, they struggle to get anything done after this impeachment trial. So 1868 is the next election, and the Republicans choose Ulysses Grant to be their candidate. Ulysses Grant had no political experience, but he was known for being the leader of the Union Army during the Civil War. The Democrats chose a guy named Horatio Seymour. A lot of people really liked Ulysses Grant because he was responsible for many battles that we won and turning the tide of the war. He fought to free the slaves, and he's a pretty popular guy. So Grant wins the election by a close popular vote. About 450,000 African American people get the chance to vote for the first time, and almost all of them vote for Ulysses Grant because he's the one who fought for their freedom. Okay, guys, I know that lesson was a little bit longer, so I need you to go into Google Classroom and open up Chapter 17, Lesson 1 and 2.